last year on storytelling and artistry. It was more focusing on like a general look at storytelling and artistry. Um, yeah, so I'll just go into the introduction then. I'm Arbie. I'm a background Timberwolf Therian, and I'm a Red Dragon Therian Mythic. I'm an artist, writer, and musician. I'm going to be doing actually a panel later, which is more of a performance where I'll be singing two of my um, self-made songs, and then Fallen Kingdom for anyone that enjoys Minecraft songs. And I'm currently working on a big artistic project that will be revealed at the end of the panel. I'm basically doing this panel because I feel like a lot more Therians should be getting into like webcomic making and writing, and I feel like there's a lot of creativity in this community, and we can all band together to make something really cool, I think. So I'll just do a quick summary of the first panel. So in the first panel, I went over more general things. What is the type of story? Well, I categorize them into three different ones, which is situation story, a character story, and a world story. Where in a situation story, um, it covers more of a concise thing. Situation story example would be Home Alone, where it just covers a boy who was left at home with where while his family goes on vacation. That would be an example for that. A character story is more focusing on a character, an individual, and their going about life and developing as a person. An example of that would be Molly and Me, um, which is a book and a movie, and just follows that character and how they go about their life and their interesting quirks. A world story would be um, just covering an interesting looking world and how that world interacts with the people. And usually it's paired with a character. And good example of this would be The Matrix, which it covers a world which is everything's in a simulation, and it goes with Neo and that character. So yeah, uh, gathering ideas briefly. You should draw from yourself, friends, family, etc. Music. I draw a lot from music. Lots of my ideas for my story have come from music and myself a lot and things that I've experienced. And don't forget that borrowing ideas is super okay. No story is 100% original, and lots of stories are derivative of others. So if you want to grab some small elements from other creative things that you enjoy, you can always do that. Always write down your ideas. That's one of the biggest points of storytelling, and never delete them, because where one thing works somewhere, um, and another thing doesn't work, could work in a different place, or even a completely different story. So going from here, I'm going to be going from the assumption that you've gathered at least the main ideas of your story, and make sure you spend at least a few hours just collecting ideas and yeah, just brainstorming and gathering from the world around you, etc., etc. So when you're going ahead from the story, you should have established a short summary of the story. Think about the initial ideas, where you want the story to go, and the eventual goal of your story. Um, so it's just making sure you have a very quick summary of your story so that it creates a very good direction when it comes to writing your story. You know what it's about, so it can be very more concise and doesn't go off in all different directions. An example of this, um, a story that I'll be working on after my big project, is in the future where most tasks are done by robots and drones. A guy uses a combination of parkour skills and speed enhancing technology to compete with elite robot run services. Um, yeah, this is just a quick, short, sweet summary of your story. It's very black and white. You understand what is going on in the story. Okay. Is everyone following all right? Everyone understanding? Okay. So when looking at a story, a good thing to look at is the emotional goal of the story, the moral of the story, or emotional throughfare of the story. It's the undertone of your story and what it's really about and what you're trying to communicate with your story. An example of this is a very simple one. Working together is the best way to get far. It doesn't have to be very complicated, it doesn't have to be very deep. It also can be if you want to do that sort of stuff or that sort of story. And you can flip it by looking at the main character's main flaw or flawed initial perspective. Usually, when you come up with a story, you have like an idea of character in your head, and their flaw could like pave the way for the summation of the story's moral. This helps bring a good direction and unity to the whole piece as you refer to it throughout the story process. And so basically, many of the characters or many of the happenings in the story would reflect back on that emotional goal of your story. And it just brings it all together. You can start with something small and then improve it after the second go over with your ideas and characters. Looking at this, you could use a technique called the dark room, which is a more literary technique that looks at the meaning of your stories. Um, it's, if, for example, the story, well, this is the dark room basically. The story is a house, and the author is showing you all the rooms. And the dark room is the point of the story. It's the only room that that you don't bring your readers to. All the rooms should let the reader infer what your story is about. Um, yeah. So basically, the your story is basically like a tour of this house, which is your story, and the all the different rooms show what the story is about. Someone mic is on, um, and it's a bit distracting. If you don't mind, it's all right. Don't worry about it. Yeah. So yeah, all the story is a house. You take your reader around the rooms that show them what the dark room is about, and the dark room is the moral of your story, basically. So, when you're looking at your story, before you go into anything, to make it more natural going into your world, you should write down and like think about establishing your world, because like our world, there was all the world before we came into it, so it makes it more natural feeling. But the number one rule of making your world is make sure that it's not getting in the way of your writing. Instead, focus, if it's getting in the way of your writing, focus on writing your story. People lots of the time get very into their world building and world writing and get lost in that. So make sure your you're focused in when you're in what you're doing. The goal in world writing is to create the illusion of a completely fleshed out world without designing every little detail, and it's more like a set. So the angle of your world is important. So when creating things, you must look into the things that you're going to focus on and write deeply about the things that you're going to be covered in your story, and not all the random things around it that aren't as important. You can go into it if you enjoy it, but as long as it's not taking away from your main writing. You should look at basic things like place and location. I mean, place is location and period, which is, if you're just creating that, it's free design. But when you go into free design, it makes it much more loose, and you don't have as much as a goal. So you should look more into setting, which is the place, but with a level of conflict over duration of time. That, looking at all those elements, is called fixed design, which is more recommended because it makes sure it concises your story building, and it doesn't make you go all over the place with it. You can also start with a level of conflict over the duration of time and then expand it into the world so that it's even more focused and even more concise. The world design helps establish consistency in your world by adding rules, for example. And rules help breed creativity to get through plot issues. So if you had a rule that prevents you from having crazy magic in your world, you would get around your issues by creating something else that would get you to that same kind of feeling of that plot point. And that would help. It helps make you more creative with your ideas in your world. And again, deciding the nuances that affect your story, and yeah, basically not anything that isn't going to be focused on. An example of this, in the story concept I made, the specifics of companies that run the delivery service of the character's world, because they have like a world that is run by those run by a specific company that has that controls most of the things in their world. And you go into the specifics of why they would want to shut down some kids, and the motivations of that company and how that company operates. That would be the specifics that you would go into, because that's where you're covering in your story. Depending on if it's based on real life or not, will determine the level of research you have to do. And it helps the believability of your world. So, for example, if you had a vaguely Aztec-inspired world, you would draw from real life and put elements and rules that come from that time period into your story to make it more believable and relate back to your world, your story. Now, once you create the world, you would put as in real life, you would then put your characters into it. The main focuses of a story, the main characters are the protagonist, antagonist, and relationship character. Firstly, the protagonist needs a clear, specific goal. It can't be vague. It needs to be something that gives them a will to drive on through that story and gives them will to interact and make sure there's conflict and such. The character needs flaws, or a flawed perspective, and unique skills or interests to make them more believable characters. Unique quirks, an example would be character has mechanical limbs, or for interests, the character likes music and or is a producer. Making sure your character has flaws is a very good thing about your very important thing in your story. And going out with a flawed perspective is very integral to your story as it relates back to the emotional through thread of the story. Often, the flawed perspective is in direct contrast to the uh, goal of the story. So, yeah, it's in direct contrast. Now, looking at the antagonist, the basic plot point of the antagonist is that it hinders the protagonist. So, therefore, not necessarily a villain. But if it is a villain, the villain also needs a specific goal. It's also better when it's relatable and could relate back to the protagonist and be changed in a sort of way, but that's not always the case. And they need also a flawed and flawed perspective. Now, the relationship character advocates for the need of the character and or the need for the resolution of the story, and also should have a clear specific goal, and is not necessarily the love interest, but can be. Sorry for hearing things in the background. My little brother is like right outside the door and trying to annoy me, but yes, I will still carry on. Yes, if the relationship character is not necessarily the love interest, but can be, and often a very interesting character when it comes back to motivations and can relate back to the main point of the story in some small way. Moving on. When you have your characters, you should gather all of your ideas and categorize them into big plot points, small plot points, and the small, cool one-off ideas that you have every so often. And when you have your other established points that I had I've said before, like the moral of the story and your other aspects, they can sometimes reinforce the main point or meaning of the story with all these points. As long as you categorize them before you go into the main plot structures, that's essentially what you need to do. Right. So, establishing the plot. The plot is divided into, obviously, the beginning, middle, and end. Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Act 1 and 3 take up approximately half of the story, and Act 2 takes up the other half. This is a plot graph provided by McKay and Gray on YouTube. You should look at their videos if you want to go into story writing. They have a lot of good and informative videos. Yeah, and this is just showing what a plot graph should look like. It should always be an upward hill and not like steps. That there should always be the story should always be building on itself, and it shouldn't ever be going like down in intensity. I mean, there can be lulls in the story or deliberating into other things, but as long as it's still going upwards and still building on your story. So there's the intro, the inciting incident, the midpoint, climax, and the resolution. Firstly, you should start in creating the end. Creating the end is useful and informs the beginning, making sure your story is based in conflict to make it interesting. And then you can go back and build up the conflict. Basically, making sure that your story is inherently full of conflict. Um, and that's why you should create the end first. It makes it less likely for you to create a story that doesn't have a lot of conflict and doesn't have something building up to. Helps set up the climax, the resolution. The climax is made up of the low point, which is usually the all is lost moment, and where they are most beaten down, the lowest they have ever been in the story, physically, emotionally, or both. Revelation is usually the characters understanding what they need to put in action, and or the protagonist or characters understanding the moral of the story and understanding protagonist's flaw and how their flawed perspective is wrong. Basically, coming into their own and understanding the breadth of their issues. Not it doesn't have to be like they understand everything, and because that would then make it a bit cliche. But they are acknowledging their flaws and also the main um, the main obstacle of the story. They can overcome it, whether it's physical, emotional, etc. The resolution is where the character gets what they want. Sometimes it's not, but as long as that's intentional and you're building up for that, um, and that's still satisfying in some way, you can make it so the story doesn't resolve that big goal. And then once if you do the character gets what they want story, the protagonist then reconciles with the relationship character. Then you go on to you go on to the beginning, and you start with the intro. The intro sets up for the end resolution. It shows the state of the protagonist before the resolution, setting up that flawed perspective. You can just show it and not make it obvious that it's flawed. For example, a character wants to work alone, but it's not is to make sure that no one else, none of their companions get hurt. So it's set up as a very understandable, relatable thing, but once you get through the story and understand, when you deliberate on all the plot points going forward, it shows throughout the story that it is then a flawed perspective. Then it is also a direct opposite to climax resolution. For example, if the ending was the main character overcoming the obstacle and getting his goal, the beginning would be him establishing the goal and what he wants to get and setting up the obstacle. The inciting incident, which comes after that, is the call, refusal, and acceptance. Call is an event that disturbs the status quo. Refusal is pretty self-explanatory. The protagonist has an unwillingness to confront the disturbance. And then the acceptance is some incident or character forces the protagonist into action. Now, establishing Act 2, the midpoint. This is shifting storytelling and from raising questions to answering them. It's where the protagonist shifts into action. They can see the solution of the conflict, but does not have the full ability to overcome it. It can be a huge revelation for happening, and again, make sure that it's full of conflict. You have to make sure that the midpoint is like almost as good as like an ending point, but obviously not as good as the ending point. It's got to make sure that it's a big turning point and a big moment for the characters, and yeah, just basically make sure it's full of conflict and a big plot point. But for example, the protagonist gets hostilized in a brazen attempt of getting the goal on their own. This also reflects back to the main point of the story, the dark room, and yeah, it's a big point of the protagonist and characters. This is sandwiched between rising action, which is the largest part of the story, and by proxy, some of the hardest things to write. When approaching rising action, it's the connection between the different plot points, the connection between the intro, the deciding incident, midpoint, climax, and resolution. It's got to essentially build um, on the story and the intensity of the story. It can have like lulls, but as long as you go back to the same intensity that's been set up from the beginning. And this is where a lot of the simple ideas come into play, where you just see them out through the story and then tweak bits to make sure that it flows along with the story. This is just an overlook of all the different specific points from McCain Gray again. Yeah. Now, this is one of my personal creations when it comes to story writing. An easy way to pacing your story and structuring your story. Firstly, list out the biggest plot points in order. That's all the plot graph that I said before. Make them into titles, and then they would be then the arc of the parts of your story, or the end point of the story. Gather all of the leftover plot ideas and put them as something that will happen during each arc, and then seed out the small plot points in between those. Basically, making each big plot point a short story on its own, and then seeding out the small ideas between that. Then going into structuring story beats. This is something that helps me remember to add very important story points that I want to include in each arc. So this is basically just looking at the arcs and what will happen in the episodes in each arc. I'll first decide how many episodes are in each arc, depending on how long I want my story to be. That's something you have to decide going in, is how long you want your story to be. You want it to be a large epic, or like a short comprised story just made of a few episodes. So you will decide how many episodes you want in each arc, and then once you list the things that you want to be included in each arc. For example, a character has emotional development in the story, or character training, or an episode dedicated to a character that's not the protagonist. And then just a lot of things that you want to make sure that is in each arc, and make sure that you fill each arc with plot developments and building things onto the story, that make sure that it's always building in intensity. Once you list enough, you can pick and choose points that you want to put into each episode, and then intersplice them with plot points before. Now, creating an outline is something very important for the story. It's basically summarizing the entire story. If you've done my arc method, you just summarize outline it arc by arc. By adding just a few things to smooth out the transitions to arc by arc, you basically have the outline of the whole story. Don't be afraid to add more ideas throughout the process, as long as you remember to record the changes so you can adjust for the effects it has on the overall story, and adjust the small bits accordingly. Scripting is a big task. It's basically just the outline with dialogue, but specifically to each episode. So collect the ideas and things, and the elements from the story beats that you wanted to include. For one episode, create a mini outline for the episode. Consider what needs to be said to advance the movement of your story and add dialogue. Change the in-between bits to directions for the content of the panels. Now, this is specifically if you're doing a webcomic or comic or visual storytelling. Keep editing again and again to make revisions after the first go through, and always look over it. When scripting, it can become hard to flesh out the entire story. So you should make sure that when you're scripting episodes, you write at it for one day, and if you feel like burnout or don't have a lot of ideas going forward into it, you go away for a day and then come back and look at it again, and usually it'll become easier. Scripting is not a fast process. It's just something that you have to be patient through and keep working on it as you go through your story. Yeah. Next slide. And then final processes is before starting, consider the art style that you want before going into it. Making sure your art style fits the genre of the story. For example, if you have like a story that's about furries and fluffy ponies, I don't know, that the art style fits that, and it will be soft and light-hearted, not like thick lines, thick black lines, and rays and dots, and yeah, dark overall. But you can make a art style that's in direct contrast to the story, but as long as it's intentional and you see that it's it works for what you're trying to show in your story. Make sure you've done concepts of your world, done sketches, things that are shown in your world, just to refer back to when creating the actual product, um, and character turnarounds are something very important to keep your characters consistent, the outfits that they wear, and the general looks of your characters. When it comes to thumbnailing, which is the basic sketch, the sketches that consider the layouts of the panels and the content of it, also considering the spacing of the word bubbles. When thumbnailing, it's got to consider the general feel of your panels and the gesture of your characters, but not going into quite so much detail that it takes way too long, or when you want to change something, you have to go through long editing process. Then you go into sketching, like actually considering the shapes of the characters and their looks, and considering the character turnarounds and stuff. Then you ink, color, shade, and then go into the speech bubbles and the dialogue that you've gone from your script. The font usually used in manga, for example, is CC words. That's basically it for my story writing process. It's not the be all end all. It's just how I have gone about creating my stories in the past, and creating webcomics and things. All this really depends on your personal preference, how you make your own stories. It's always best to do your own research when it comes to these things. You can always take ideas from different people and see what works for you when creating your stories. Because I'm more of a person that creates long-winded stories that take a lot of character development and rising of action and different kind of things, different kind of that come together and create a large hefty story. Per se. If you want to create a small story, it's just all these ideas, but just concise and just small a bit. And all of these things will basically work for all different types of making processes, for writing, for making games even. But as long as you adjust the small finer details to the format that you're working in. I said before that I have a big project that I've been working on for a while, and basically it's called Tremendous Shards of Fire, and it's an action drama about my character Bullet following his adventure to discover himself, his power, and navigating his mind, emotion, and mental issues, and coming to terms with his animality compared to others and instincts. This story is a webcomic, and I will be releasing it on Tapas and Webtoon, hopefully in December. Been working on it for a very long time. The story has a lot of serious and adult themes, so please read the Tapas version if you're over 18. But there will be another all ages version released on Webtoon later than September. So yeah. The promo section, have an Instagram, Twitter. If you want to ask me about different things with the story and arting and drawing and stuff. I have a Ko-Fi and a Patreon that will be really helpful because my tablet is broken during this time while I was working on all these different things. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed my panel. Hope it was informative to you. Please talk to me about stories that you decide to create that help. If this panel has helped you in any way, please come talk to me. My DMs are always open. Yeah, that's it really. Thank you for listening. Also, I'm gonna be doing my singing, my performance later on today. In singing, so two songs, two original songs. Actually come from a novel I'm making. And then my then it's only given, So yeah, thank you for coming. And I will see you guys. Rock on, hope you enjoy the rest of your on.